Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Mats Lederhausen. Mats is an incredible individual with a resume that would take a really long time for me to list through, so I'm not going to do it. But highlights are, stints at McDonald's as a super high senior executive and leader, part of McDonald's venture, chairman of Chipotle, investor, nonprofit leader, thought leader. But what makes Mats super inspiring as a person is that he's been someone who's been at the forefront of this conversation around what is the nature of business or what should be the nature of business going forward. And he's been consistently talking about things that we care about here at the Nick Halaris Show, like, can business be a force for good? And if so, how? And I've just really enjoyed getting to know Mats over the last month or two and diving into his thinking, and this is going to be an incredible conversation. So Mats, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, man. I'd like to start this with a discussion around some writing that you've been doing, which I've been really enjoying. You just finished a 8-part series on Capitalism 3.0, and I feel like that sort of really succinctly summarizes what feels like, just from engaging with you and studying your history, what feels like literally like 30 years of thinking and practicing, as an actual business leader at some of these, Titan type companies that we mentioned. So let's talk about Capitalism 3.0. I think the place that I wanted to start is like, what's the problem with Capitalism 2.0? And how does that lead into Capitalism 3.0?
Yeah, I learned many, many years ago from Paul Hawken, who I was involved with in the environmental movement in the 90s, Europe primarily, when we talked about capitalism. And he said to me, Mats, there's nothing wrong with capitalism. We just haven't tried it yet. And, I'm a big believer in capitalism, and we will go into more of that, I'm sure, as we talk. But I guess the problem with capitalism is that too many people, for a whole set of reasons, doubt it, are ready to reject it, want to replace it rather than reboot it. And I think that will be a terrible mistake. It will be like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I think what characterizes our time more than anything, and we can go into that too, whether it's social media or whose fault that is, whatever. But we live in a very binary culture where you have to be solely believe in one of two options. You have to be a Republican or a Democrat. You have to be pro-capitalism or against capitalism. You have to either like making money or do something good, black or white, binary or non-binary. We have all these false choices that all pushes us to a really terrible place. I think humanity and life well lived always lives in the gray. It lives in the middle. And I think you have to have the capacity to hold two truths in your soul at the same time. One is, capitalism is by far the best way to organize affairs. You can talk to anybody, you can study history. Anybody that rejects it ends up in tyranny, death. I mean, you can look at anything. I was just reading up this weekend on Maria Corina Machado, the latest Nobel laureate, the Peace Prize. She's given plenty of speeches about the evil of socialism, which the people that actually are critical of capitalism, they probably would vote socialism in and capitalism out, or communism in and capitalism out. And that would be a terrible mistake. Now, having said all of that, capitalism is very imperfect. There are many people that are not benefiting from the pros of capitalism. There's too much unaffordability in whether it's housing or public transport. Our budget deficits are running amok. Why is that? And so I've always been a concerned capitalist, and I've always been viewing the world as, I love capitalism. We can do better than this, and we can get into some of that. But that's kind of what I'm hoping. And the last thing I'd say on that is, we also need to recognize that the world we're living in today is very different from when we designed the principles of our current market-based system. And that is true for all our institutions. It's not just true for capitalism. It's true for education. It's certainly true for healthcare. We can get into all of them. But they were designed for a very different world, a very linear world, a very mechanistic world, a very hardware-oriented world, not a software-oriented world. And, what I think the world is going through now, which feels so desperately fractured, is that we are struggling with, redesigning, re-engineering, rethinking, reimagining all our institutions. They have to be. And most of the times in history, when you go through these times, it is very difficult because the people in power don't want to let go. The people in power are the ones that benefited and succeeded in the old structures, and they are never the same people that would succeed in the new. And that is what we're going through right now. And that's also why it feels so fraught with hate and dehumanization, and people use all sorts of mechanisms to shoot down the other guy that has some new ideas. And I resist that. I reject that. I want to be a bridge builder between the two worlds.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, one of the many things I really appreciate about your perspective and your thought leadership is that, it's so easy to go down the dark side, and you've refused. You're just standing forth and saying, "Hey, listen, why don't we consider this in a different way?" And it's sad to say, but there's actually so few people doing that. But I really like the way you frame that, because I've been thinking a lot about this too, maybe from a slightly different angle, just from a historical standpoint, because this isn't the first time that people have come to criticize capitalism. Right? Like, you just rewind the clock like 100 and whatever, 50 years or so. And the original critics of capitalism had their reasons too. And so you get people like Marx, who I actually think correctly identified one of the major problems of capitalism, which you hinted at in your answer, which is that it sort of skews to unfairness, because capitalism is highly beneficial to those who have capital. And so he correctly diagnosed a problem of capitalism, one of its imperfections. And then he went to do exactly what you said. Like, why don't we just throw the whole thing out and design this new system, which has really no relation to humanity? And that's the intellectual mistake that Marx made. And what's scary about the time that we're living through, I completely agree with you. It feels like we just forgot that we've already learned that lesson. The 20th century is like so obviously teaching that lesson, that you can't impose a non-human system on human beings and expect there to be a good result. And yet here we are, even here in America, right? The land of capitalism, supposedly, we're turning in that direction, and it's frightening.
Yeah, it really is. It is frightening. But, we have to also own up to what we can do about it. I have a lot of conversations with people about what can we do? Well, it's interesting how many people that are critical of capitalism, when I ask them, what are you doing about it? What choices are you making as a consumer? And a lot of people don't think that has any effect, which of course is wrong. If more people bought the kind of healthcare they want to buy, the kind of cars they want to buy, the kind of whatever the society they want, if they let their purchase behavior and their voting behavior reflect that, we will gradually change society more. And I saw that firsthand at McDonald's. When I tried to help McDonald's many, many years ago sell healthier food, my boss said to me, like, if parents can't get their kids to eat broccoli, why is that my problem? So if you want better food, parents, hello, ask your kids to go order broccoli. And you know what? McDonald's will serve it. And this is a little bit like, I'm a big fan of Robert, a book from whatever it was, 1973 or 63. I mean, many years ago. Servant Leadership is a great book. And in there, he has this somewhat counterintuitive position about business, where he basically said that if we want business to serve us better, we have to love them. And, what you love, you care for. And somehow today, the critique of capitalism has landed, the critique even of politics have landed in a place where people hate business and they hate politics. They even hate America because they're so critical about some aspects of America. And I think that is a not only very unfortunate place, it's a very counterproductive place to be. You cannot build a better future with hate. You can only build it with love.
Yeah.
And that might sound like vanilla or veneer, but I don't think it is. I think it's true.
I think it's true because it appeals to something that's true about human beings. Like, that's what we care about, right? Like, there's all these like self-help gurus out there, and the good ones are always pointing to the truth, which is like, at the end of the day, right? At the end of life, what matters is all these relationships that you've had in your life. That's what people actually care about, and the strength of those connections and whatnot. It's so easy to lose sight of that when we look at the world through simplified lenses, like how much money do you have in your bank account and how big is your house, and we get caught up in all this other stuff, and we lose sight of like the pretty basic truth about us is that we just want to be loved and in love with as many people as possible.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I really appreciate about your messaging and your thought leadership is that you have been willing to do what most people are sort of afraid to do, which is question the short-term thinking and short-term incentive structure of our system. Everybody who really seriously studies what's going on Wall Street knows this is a problem, but so few people are willing to speak out about it because they are benefiting from it in such a profound way that I just appreciate that you're willing to do that. So I want to talk about that and just get your take on why that's such a big deal and why it's holding us back.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest problems in modern culture. I often say that we live in a short-term world with long-term problems. If you think about, you could talk to anybody. What are the big problems? You would get a list that sounds like something like inequality, climate change, affordable housing, better education, better health care, you name it. But I think you're going to get a list that is fairly in harmony, and a lot of people would agree with the list. Now, then ask your question. Okay, if we want to improve all of these things, are these like a quarter problems? Are they a year problems? Are they 2-year solutions, I would say? What's the duration of sets of solutions that can really make a dent? Any sane person would say it's at least a decade. It might be 2 decades. It might be generational. And yet we invest our hopes and our electoral freedoms. And I'm not thinking only about electing political leaders. I'm thinking about the choices we make broadly and where we invest our hopes, whether it, 401k allocations or, you name it. Most people have a much shorter expectations than reasonably, and then they have reason to have. And that causes misalignment, and it's really unhealthy, and it's not good. And I think the biggest criticism I have of capitalism, but I wage the same criticism of education. Too much test focused, too much, whatever it is. Healthcare, typically, like you go to a doctor's office, you have a complaint. Most patients, it's not even the doctor's faults, really. Most patients demand an immediate solution. Like, I want this, I want to fix, I want to numb my pain, I want an MRI, I want this and this and this. Very few doctors would say, well, let's sit down and have a long conversation about your life. And well, how are you eating? How are you moving? We don't do that, which is the right thing to do. And it would solve a lot of healthcare problems, right? But we've created a culture of instant gratification, insta life. And it's a really destructive, counterproductive way of living. Ultimately, I'm toying around writing a book about living life in reverse. I mean, that's the ultimate long-termism, right? It's like every human should really start with, I think it's a good frame. Every human being at some point, maybe not when you're 5, but when you gain some consciousness about what you want in life, whenever that happens, we can debate. Most therapists say that your soul starts coagulating sometime around 25 and then, maybe 30. Once you're there, you better sit down and ask yourself, what do I want out of this life? I only have one. I think most of us believe we only have one life. Some believe we have more, but I don't. And at the end of that journey, however long you're here for, we don't know that. We don't know when it ends. We don't know how it ends. I think most people would agree that it would be nice if you look back at your life with some kind of joy and happiness for the choices you made. And what does that look like? I've gone through the exercise of who do I want to be at my funeral? What do I want them to say? What do I want my life to have stood for? And if you ask yourself those things, you pretty much and pretty quickly come to the realization that if I want certain people to travel to my funeral, I better invest time with them now, over many periods of time, long periods of time. And, if you want your life to stand for something, you better work on that and work on that for a long time. And I think that resolves a lot of issues in your life if you think about that. And I think that's true for businesses too. I think businesses that have a very long game, and in fact, one of my best friends is launching a book tomorrow called The Long Game. Maybe you should interview him.
We'd love to.
Roy Becker. He's spent some time looking into this too. Lastly, I'd say I saw this firsthand at when I was at McDonald's, and I talked to analysts. I talked to people that, covered McDonald's. privately, they had all sorts of views how McDonald's could be better. But when they asked us questions as a management team on quarterly earnings calls, those questions never arose. They only asked questions about what's the margin in the next quarter. And I said to them privately at dinners, I said, it would help me changing McDonald's towards the direction you want them to go if you ask those questions. It would help us believe that you believed in it. And it's a misalignment. And I think most CEOs you would interview, whether they would admit it or not, would say, and in fact, many have given up guidance. I mean, Jamie Dimon has publicly said, many people have said publicly, it's a bad idea. So, I think we would be better off if we were a little bit more patient. And I'd say that doesn't mean short-term doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Long-term is nothing but a stacked up short-termisms. So you have to pay attention to the day, and there are things that change. And I say jokingly that I'm impatiently patient. I want great results for sure, but I look out for the long term. And if you build something for the longer term, you do better. Let's do this thought experiment, Nick. If you and I own a business, we own the business to 100%. And in whatever business it was in, and let's say it had $50 million of revenue and $5 million of EBITDA, something like that. And you and I said, there are two things we can do. We want to absolute maximize profitability of this business in a year, or we want to maximize profitability in 10 years. Do you think our decisions will be different?
%. Yep.
I think maximizing profit in a year, it's really easy. You get rid of a lot of people. You stop paying for a lot of things, and you then make a lot more money. It's not hard. And that's what a lot of businesses do. And then the poor buyer of that business gets, stuck with a bag, and they have to reinvest. And we go through these cycles versus if you maximized and optimized value creation over long periods of time, you would invest more in your people. You would invest more in the health of your people. You would invest more in your buildings. You would invest more in customers. You wouldn't maximize price. You would optimize pricing. You would do a lot of things differently. And I think that will be a better world.
Yeah, well said. And I couldn't agree more. I feel like that little thought experiment that we just did, that's essentially what's going on over and over and over again at every scale of capitalism in the world. People are making that first decision of saying, let's try to maximize this. And then to add a little even more sort of short-term incentive, there's all these financial players who are going around buying and selling these businesses to each other based on those short-term gains. And then it all comes to an end one day when the business has been basically ransacked for every possible short-term gain it can get to, and then someone has to either the business just disappears, it gets creatively destroyed or financially destroyed, depending on how you want to look at it, or it gets innovated out of existence. But there's a bunch of pain down the road. I remember early in my career, actually, I worked at a public utility company, big one. They owned all kinds of assets all over the place, and we were there to try to help them. I was doing strategy consulting. We were there to try to help them improve their performance. And what's crazy is that they were natural gas pipelines, and they were producing ridiculous operating income. But the secret is that they weren't doing the CapEx. And so Buffett came to look at buying it because it had such crazy operating margins. And he was like, wait, well, you haven't done CapEx in 30 years. So he did the math on what the CapEx would cost and obviously walked away. But I feel like that little story is probably happening on businesses everywhere. I mean, has that been your experience working in these big Fortune 10 type companies?
Yeah, no, clearly. I mean, I don't know if I've been lucky, I think, in that way. I don't think McDonald's was different because it was a franchised organization, and our franchisees there were really great, and they took care of their businesses because they were local owners. So I don't think McDonald's was a great example of accumulated debt, if you will. But look at our country. I would argue we've run our country a little bit like that. Look at Illinois, where I used to live, which has unfunded pension obligations. Look at our infrastructure. Look at our airports. Look at much of that. We have not maintained our cities and our infrastructure the way we should because we have looked too much on the short term instead of building visionary cities for the future. So I think we're all guilty of it. And I think we all participate to some extent in this short-term appetite. and we have to stop. And I think we have to align our systems. I mean, think about it this way. People ask me, how would you do this? I'm not expert. I would talk to some Nobel laureates in economics or something. They're all in Chicago, so you can reach them there. I'm kidding. Actually, today, as we speak, one of the laureates in economics, which is announced and handed out at my business school in Stockholm, not handed out, but they have a lecture every year, which I used to go to, which is fun. One of the Nobel laureates is from Northwestern, which is interesting, from Chicago. But anyway, I think that one of the ideas that I often think about, and I don't know how this would work, I leave this to experts, but you think about it, we have decided in our infinite wisdom that it makes sense to incentivize longer term holdings, broadly speaking, right? Because we have a long-term capital gains tax and a short-term capital gains tax. The cutoff is 1 year. I don't know about you, but I don't think 1 year is particularly long-term. So what happened if that was 5 years? What would happen if it was 10? What would happen if we had a progressive or regressive taxation? I don't know about you, but I think anybody that makes a fortune in like less than a year, the socially redeeming value of that is not great for the rest of society.
Yeah.
What if like that started at like 80% and it went down to 20 if you held it really long? I know a lot of people would have all sorts of arguments for why that's hard, and I get it, but let's not be, perfection be the enemy of good. I think we can do something here that pushes us to help our culture think longer.
Yeah. I really like that idea. I was going to ask you about that because one of the things in your writing that jumped out at me, I like that because I think it could serve the goal of incentivizing long-term behavior and also disincentivizing what I see as a real big growing problem in our culture and our economy, which is like this speculative fever. People love to think that capitalism and Wall Street is all about this like math and serious thinking, but a lot of it is just straight up speculation. And now the speculation is rolling into like we're legalizing gambling everywhere. And so you can't watch a football game without being fed ads to, gamble on the game. And I think this is all really bad. We know enough about gambling to know that it's going to be like predatory on people who at least can afford to pay for it and cause all kinds of problems. But so I love the idea of like, man, maybe we should try to disincentivize that kind of behavior. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't think a lot about how to stop certain things. I think more about how to start better behaviors. I'm not against much in life. I am against the notion that, I'm an old school capitalist in a sort of Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill way. People forget that the grandfather or father of capitalism, Adam Smith, was not an economist. He was a moral philosopher. And, it's important to think about why capitalism exists and what it's for. And I agree with the sentiment you're positing, which is that in many people's eyes, and to some extent in reality, capitalism has become, over the last 20, 30 years, too much of capitalism. By far not the majority of it, but too much of capitalism has become sort of a betting industry. People make bets, I always tell people, like, when I meet people that say things like, oh, I invested in this stock and I got out right in time. I don't find that, lucky. Yeah, maybe. But I like to live in a world where if I build something and it's worth, $10 and I take it all the way to $20 and I sell it to you, I want you to make as much money going forward or more. I think building something that sort of erodes and collapses is not admirable. It's not also avoidable. I mean, there will be businesses for a whole set of reasons that are poorly executed, that, didn't go from horsewhips to engines or whatever the analogy might be. And for those owners that didn't see that coming, they should be penalized and lose value. I think that's part of I write that in one of my pieces on capitalism. Like, one of the least favored and maybe most important part of capitalism is sort of Schumpeter's, creative destruction. In fact, this Nobel Prize that was awarded today is actually very much at the core center of creative destruction, as much as I've read up on it so far today. But it is a very healthy part of capitalism that penalizes mistakes. which I like. And I like it as a father. I like it. Yeah, I don't think we should reward people that, make bad decisions. We should incentivize good decisions. So that's automatic in capitalism. Yes, too much of financialization of business is not good. And I think we've had too much of it. I think on a scale, I think we've tilted too much of it. Now, there are a lot of people that would say to this, oh, we need it because it helps liquidity, it helps transaction costs. And there are lots of sort of capital market efficient arguments for why that's necessary in a part of capitalism that's good. And I'm not against it, but I think we've had too much of it on a scale of sort of 1 to 10. And short selling to me is also, I have questions about what the socially redeeming value of short selling is. I can see a value, if somebody really, it's a good way to make your argument across. I really hate this business. I'm going to buy a bunch, I'm going to sell a bunch of stock short. But is that business? My view is that business should be building businesses that serve human needs well at a profit.
Yep.
I believe in competition, and I believe in may the best guy win. And if you look at the history, most businesses that have stood the test of time and been at it for a long time and had a long-term vision, whether it's, Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or whatever, a lot of those people have done pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. With the focus on, that's the sort of counterpoint to like the hyper focus on quick wins or the financialization is like, if you look at the truly great business success stories, the fortunes, the ones that people will remember history, they were not playing that game. They were playing a much different game. And the game was like, let me build a durable business. Yeah. I feel like the financialization piece is mostly positive, but it's negative in this one respect, which is that it's created a culture where like people can and do make money by sort of taking advantage of each other. And to me, that's been like to our detriment, right? Like, how is that good for anybody? Even the person who does it, right? Like, yeah, so you got a SPAC done in 2022 and made a, $100 million fee for doing your SPAC, but then it went to zero. Like, yeah, you made 100 and all your investors lost. Like, how is that a win? But in some sense in our culture, people kind of see that as a win. Yeah.
It has two problems. One is if too many people are involved in that kind of version of capitalism, it's a problem because the trickle-down effects of all those activities is very limited. One of the key great things about old school capitalism is if you build a business, well, yeah, I was part of McDonald's. It created hundreds of thousands of success stories, because it is a broad-based industry where lots of people get their first job and they can get promoted and they become a franchisee and blah, blah, blah. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, I'll tell you a story. When I was a young man and I took over McDonald's in Sweden as a young man, Sweden is very unionized and I struggled with the unions. I did because I didn't always see eye to eye with what they wanted. I give a sidebar on that. It's like one of the first fights I had with them was that they wanted to give all my employees a lunch break at lunch. And I had a fit. I'm in the restaurant industry. They got to work during lunch. That's when my customers are there. So they were reasonable in the end and they found an agreement. But I talked to their chief economist once. And we talked about all of these things about like capitalism and jealousy and why people don't always like business people and blah, blah, blah. And he gave me the following story. And I by and large agree with him. He said to me, listen, here's how I look at wealth and wealth creation. I have a neighbor where I live. And every day I go out and get my paper. This is 35 years ago. Go out and get my paper. He works his lawn. He works his flowers. He works his yard. And every night I come home from work, he's out there working. His yard is like 100 times nicer than mine because I never spend any time on it. I don't have time. I don't value it. And I am not jealous of him. I applaud him. I see the sweat of his labor and it's fine. But I feel less supportive if somebody just comes there and they just, 5 guys come in during a day and boom, 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 because he has much more money than me and he just gets a much nicer yard. It feels different to me, he said. And, I wouldn't go as far as the way that I agree with him completely, but at least there is a sentiment that I think if you ask a lot of Americans if they feel a sense of envy anger, jealousy towards the wealth of, Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or even Elon, who is controversial in some ways? I think the answer is no. I don't think so. I think the jealousy and anger and at least lack of understanding is more the quick trade fortunes that are made. They're harder to understand, even though they have a value too. So I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying it's easier to understand. And the last point I'll say on this topic, it's important because I find this hopeful. I do want to talk to you about what gives us hope and what should give us hope. And that is, I mean, two things. One, some people funnily or jokingly say that Karl Marx maybe was right, that the means of production will fall in the hands of the workers. To some extent, that is happening because talent is so important. So the people that actually create the wealth, the people that actually work in the companies are more and more and more and more important. And I think that's hopeful versus capital because capital has been all more or less commoditized. So I think that's going to steer capitalism in a both more moral and better direction because I think they're humans making those choices that actually are involved and implicated and work for things. The other thing that's happening that I think is also very hopeful is that more and more voices like, Alex Karp at Palantir wrote a book about it. There's several books written lately about this notion that let's inspire the smartest people that go into business, best people that go into business, inspire them to build great solutions to our biggest problems instead of just, launching another app. There's this old quote. Who was that? Was that somebody said way back when in the first generation of the internet is like, we had all these hopes and dreams and all we got was 140 characters.
Yeah.
Not to belittle Twitter or X, just to say, I want the smartest and best generation to dedicate themselves to solving big problems, not small problems.
Yeah. Which is hopeful. And I agree with your other point too. Like one of the things I've been writing a lot about in Profit Plus is this idea of positioning. And what's amazing about our time is that capitalism is becoming more democratic. Ownership positions are becoming much easier to obtain. And that's one of the areas where we have seen material progress. Like if you looked at 19th century capitalism versus what we see today, like, man, there are way more opportunities for people who in the old days of capitalism, were being sort of taken advantage of, to use a phraseology that Marx would use, right? Like there was a sense in which early capitalism was exploitative because labor could not participate on the other side of the ledger. They were just being paid a wage and they didn't get any ownership. And over time, here in this country, but all around the world, like we actually opened up all kinds of channels to allow for ownership. That was part of what the financialization boom was all about. And now it's happening sort of on steroids because we're getting this decentralized world. And so like all kinds of people who in previous iterations of this system were not given access to ownership are now getting access to it. And that is going to change people's perspectives about capitalism because they're going to feel a part of it rather than someone being taken advantage of.
And that's actually it's a great point. And there's a great TED talk. And now, of course, I'm blanking on his name, but he is a KKR executive. He gave a TED talk last year or a year before on ESOP, on sort of employee-owned businesses, and it's a very powerful story. And I do think there might be regulatory enhancements to stimulate that too. Could we make it more tax efficient to share ownership with employees in businesses? There are some pretty tax efficient ways to do it today, but could there be better ones and more ones that are aligned with long-term value creation with the people working in the businesses? I think that would be all great.
Yep. Game changer. And I feel like there is a lot of momentum. I've read several stories about this movement in private equity to really think differently about employee ownership. And
Yes.
it's exciting because that really will move the needle. And every once in a while, you hear these stories in the news of like a local business owner who gave us his shares of his private company to all his employees. And like when he died, everybody became fantastically wealthy or they were being made wealthy. You hear that occasionally, but I feel like there's an opportunity to do that at scale. Given modern technology, quite frankly, it's easier to kind of keep track of these things with these digital ledgers. And if we changed a couple of the regulations, it could actually make a difference and go against some of this trend that we talked about at the beginning, where people are turning away from capitalism because they feel like they can't participate or they don't have a shot at whatever the American dream is now. And so they're like, okay, well, maybe communism sounds interesting again. Hopefully this is
Pete Stavros.
okay. Perfect.
But it's, that's it's clearly a hopeful development.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to turn now to the other side of your message, because I feel like there's two really important sides of your messaging and thought leadership over this, long career. One is the willingness to take a hard look at what's going on in capitalism and discuss things like short-termism and executive compensation tied to short-termism, which is, one of the biggest problems in our system. Like, very few people have ever been willing to talk about that. I appreciate that you've done that. But there's another side which is really positive and hopeful, which is like, how can we, to use your phrase from the beginning, not throw it out, but how do we reboot capitalism to address some of these concerns? And what does that look like? And I've been just so animated by this idea for the last 5 or 6 years. Like, business really can be a force for good in this world. And I would just love to, let's talk about your vision for what that looks like.
Yeah, but what I guess let's start with what it's not. It's easier, right? Because, again, I come back to this binary culture. I mean, a lot of this comes back to culture. We have to sort of seed a different culture. We have to help, particularly the younger generation, believe in capitalism, because I think too many don't. And if you don't believe in it, they're never going to participate in creating solutions that will work for them either. So I think a lot of this, unfortunately, is cultural. And I do think we can talk about that also. I think there's some hopeful signs that culture is changing in that regard, slowly. But somehow lately, I don't know when it had started, and we should talk about social media, because it is a problem. It is a real problem. One of my good friends that I spent a lot of time with, his name is Dolph Seidman. I think we talked about him last time. He's a moral philosopher. He always invokes David Hume when we talk about this notion that morality fades with distance. And it's very obvious when you think about it. We care most about the people that are closest to us. We just do. It's just a human thing. And, when people sit in their bubble on social media platforms, and they never really meet people, they never touch people, they have opinions about things that goes on, far away, and it's easy to have likes and dislikes. We've created a culture that is pretty, as David Brooks says, we over politicize and under moralize. So some of it has to do, my first beginning is that get sort of a coalition of people, a broad coalition of Americans that agree on a few things rather than disagree on everything. What can we agree on? Okay. I think it needs to start there. Well, I certainly, from my writing and my vantage point, is I'll start. What do we agree on? Well, I think America is great. I think we have started to disagree on that. I think that's wrong. I mean, is it perfect? No. Can it be a lot better? Yes. Is it working for everybody? No. But is it a terrible country? No. I think it's a great country from my vantage point. So that would be a good start. Second is, business and capitalism have been and can be more so a force for good. If we embrace that, and if we enable that, if we consider ideas to make that even stronger and better and more powerful. Can we agree on that? I think a lot of people can agree on these 2 points, more so than they would admit, but I think so. At least that's my perspective. So I think we should start with a few things that we can agree on and what this is not. The third thing I'd say that we should agree on is that solutions to big problems primarily has to be rooted in agency, has to be rooted in people's ability to make better decisions for them and their families. I do not believe, and this is why socialism and communism doesn't work. I do not believe, and I do not believe this with a great deal of passion, that you can elect 6 people in Washington to solve the problems for all Americans. It just won't work. It goes against the grain of human nature. It won't work. I'd like it to work because it would be easier. But I think just look at history, look at our own history, and look at other countries' history. It doesn't work. And I guess the last thing we should agree on, and this is more And this is more a nod to the right side of the political spectrum, which is, can we agree that America isn't perfect for everyone? Can we agree that there are a lot of things we need to do differently and better? Can we agree that we are spending twice as much money than any other nation on the poorest healthcare system in the Western world, at least in terms of delivery of health outcomes, which should be, is there another way to measure health? I don't think so. Must be health outcomes for everybody. It's terrible. Our education system isn't working. People are less and less educated, at least on catered to poorly. So we have a lot of issues. Can we agree on that? And can we agree that it's not okay? And can we agree that we should all collectively work hard for a different and more positive trajectory here? So I think that's where it starts. And I think we're far from there today, unfortunately. Unless we go there, today, most discourse is hateful. It's about making the other guy lose. It is not solutions oriented. It's revenge oriented on both sides. And I think that's very, very unfortunate. So I'm trying to be like a typical Swedish guy. We haven't talked much about this, but that's where I'm from, trying to stand in the middle and say, how can we agree? How can we unite? And how can we go to work? And I think capitalism has to be a big part of the solution. And today, it is certainly, but it can be a lot more so. I think it must start with broad agreement that that's possible.
Yeah.
And today, I don't think we have that. I don't think we have that politically. I don't think we have it in academia. We certainly don't have it in media. When something is bad going on, we have a very negativity biased media. I think they are all mainly like short sellers. They almost thrive on crisis. And the only thing that sells is like when people are suffering. And it's a really bad surround sound for humanity. We have to resurrect a more positive, hopeful worldview, because it is more hopeful and positive than what you would think if you open TikTok or CNN, right? Go on. I say to people that are very negative, is like, have you been out lately? Have you been to a bar, a restaurant, walk down the streets of, I'll give you one example. We had a dear friend, a big family wedding in Chicago recently. And a lot of people flew in that typically don't come to Chicago. And you've read about Chicago, whether it's like the whole, civil or the guard, the army, the crime, whatever
War
it is.
zone. Yeah. Right.
They all said to me like, Mats, what an amazing city. We went to the beach. People are friendly. Yeah, it's great. Glad you're out. The world is much better than we give it reason to believe in. And I often, in my next post this week, I'm launching a new series on something very hopeful, which is about love. And I often quote and I often watch the beginning scene of Love Actually, where Hugh Grant says something to the fact that I won't quote it. I don't have it in front of me, but basically says, when I'm really feeling gloomy, I go to Heathrow and I watch the arrival gate at Heathrow and I see brothers and sisters and parents and everybody's hugging each other. And he also says that from his understanding, when he looked at all the messages sent on 9/11 from the planes to their loved ones, there were no messages of hate. They were all about love. And his point is, if you really look hard, I get a sneaky feeling that love is all around. And I think it is, more so than we are led to believe. And the last point I say about this is, as you might have gathered from my writing, is that we underdose in our belief on placebo. Meaning, I have been fascinated for a long time about the effects of placebo. You look at medical research, people's physiology change just because they believe in something. Belief is a very powerful human attribute, and it's not fake, it's real. It affects us profoundly. And we've created a culture. We have we can talk about a climate crisis. I think we have a cultural climate crisis more than anything. I am not worried for a minute about the challenges we face in life. I think we have the tools and the people and the talent to overcome them easily. I really worry about our culture. And our culture is overdosing on negativity and hate. And that, with that as a grounding, foundation, we will not solve these problems. We have to overcome that. So I think it's a long-winded way of saying, job one, restore a more hopeful, less hateful type of discourse where we collaborate on finding solutions that can take us to our desired place.
Yeah, man. Well said. There's a lot actually to unpack in that answer.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Let me start from the back though, because I agree with your fundamental premise that this is actually, for all the things we like to talk about it, like climate change and economic inequality and whatnot, actually the problem is a cultural problem. And technology is exacerbating a trend towards selfishness. One of the things that I've been writing a lot about is that, like, America is this like genius creation of a place, really unique historical place for one major reason, and it's that it's about the individual. Like, America is about the individual and the individual's opportunity to make something of his or her life, whatever that may be. And there's not that many restrictions on it. It certainly has gotten better and better over time, right? We're not perfect. But the downside of that kind of energy is that it can tend towards selfishness. And what's happened in sort of your working career and my half of my working career so far is like, man, we have really over indexed on the selfishness. Like, we have essentially like developed, because of these digital technologies, like a narcissistic kind of sickness that has infected everything. And then if you couple it with things like short-termism, which we talked a lot about in this very specific context of business and politics, it's happening in life too, right? Like, people are saying like, you know what, I don't really want to work out anymore. Like, I'll take the Ozempic, let me get a hit of that. Right. So like, you see this selfishness, short-term, instant gratification culture, like, everywhere. You'd have to be blind not to see it. And it really is a problem. And it's not like, in my view, I'm hopeful about it though, because there are a whole bunch of people who are seeing that it's a problem, number one, and then adjusting their behavior accordingly. And so if you keep your eyes open and get off the internet, you actually see some really interesting trends around health and fitness, for example, where people are doing all kinds of stuff to better their lives, and self-help, like the podcast world that we're in, and the writing world. There's like a lot of writers who are writing about this. So there is this sort of cultural counter push back in another direction, but I think we're in the early stages of that. Like, we're nowhere near a victory, but we're headed in the right direction. Do you get that same feeling?
Yeah, no, I can see what you're saying. But I have a lot of businesses where I actually am fortunate enough to be out and about with regular average people in grocery stores, and I see very little hate. I don't see the kind of hate that I see in media in real life. I took a walk with my wife this morning here. We are, right now we're in a rental house. It's a beautiful place, but it's, fairly regular people, upper middle class. Everybody says good morning. People are friendly. I said hello to the policeman. I have the following two reasons to be really optimistic. Let me say that clearly, because I need to be optimistic. I want to be optimistic, and I am optimistic. I say to people all the time, I'm a fundamentalist. I'm a fundamental optimist. Maybe because I have to be. I can't go up in the morning if I just look at everything that brings me down. I have two reasons beyond others that makes me optimistic. One is I believe with all my heart and soul, and call me naive, and I'm okay if I'm dead and on my tombstone says, here's Mats Lederhausen, he was naive. I'm okay being naive because I want to be romanticizing humanity. But I believe the vast majority of human beings are good. We can debate if it's 98% or 96% or even 92%, but the vast majority of people that aren't in an institution or suffering madly, and I'd be the first to say way too many people have mental problems and all of that. But despite all of that, the vast majority deep down in their soul want to do good, They wake up every morning, want to do something good, not something bad. And secondly, the other thing I believe in with all my soul is that knowledge is power. I believe that a better educated public, more education is not always better, but from where we are, more education is better for the vast majority of people. Most people agree with that too. And for the first time in history, in human history, this is not a small statement. For the first time in human history, the world's accumulated knowledge is available basically for free to any human being on the planet soon. Not quite there yet today, but with Starlink and some other features, maybe soon. But, the vast majority of humans have now available to them in their hands the world's accumulated knowledge. If you look at the history of humanity, for the vast majority of time, the power of education sat in the hands of the kings and the priests and the wealthy. It was not broadly distributed to people. And for a long time in teachers. In fact, our current view of education, too much to distill to this day, is that education is basically the transference of knowledge. So our education system is very medieval. You have a teacher in front of the pupils, the students, and the teacher's job is to transfer what he and she knows to the students. I am being a little bit facetious and over-exaggerating a little bit for effect. But it's not far from true, right? It's kind of, I'll give you a test. You show me that you know the answers I know.
Yep.
And that's not education, and it's not working well. And thank God we now have the tools to change it. And it's changing rapidly, not rapidly enough. But if you believe that people are good, and if you believe that so many people will now have a level of knowledge that they never had access to, I believe the outcome of those two good things has the chance to create a really, really bright future with lots of advancements along the lines of many things that I'm excited about. Can things go wrong? Absolutely. Are there risks with AI? Of course. We can go down the list of problems, but you have to start with what's positive. You can't start with what's negative. And that's my biggest critique of our current culture. We have overdosed on somehow wanting to swim in shit. It's like
Yeah.
people love talking about what the problems are. Can we start with what's good and what it can be? And then we can go back from there and say, okay, how do we avoid the risks here?
Yeah.
And I just really think that's important, Nick. And I try to remind people of that.
Man, well said. Like I recently wrote a piece about the American dream, and I was thinking about like housing, education, healthcare. Those are the three things people like to complain about the most. And no, it's okay in our country. And man, given all the technology, given the talent of our people, like under no circumstances are we unable to address the problems in those industries. All we have to do is just change our focus. Like instead of complaining about it, we just need to get busy fixing it. And so I couldn't agree more with sort of that hopeful sentiment. But man, as you were giving that answer, it just reminded me of something that happened to me recently, where I was listening to this podcast called Living Myth. I forget the name of the podcast host, but it's really fascinating podcast. And the host was sharing a story from, I don't even remember what culture it was, but it was a myth type story, a creation myth. And in this creation myth, these four people kind of go out into the wilderness and they just wait for contact from God. And God comes back and gives them knowledge. But the people who gain this knowledge have to come back and use that to help the community. And so there was like the whole point of the myth. I'm not doing it justice. The podcast host really told it well and it was inspiring. But the whole point of the myth is that knowledge is meant for healing. And so what's optimistic about what you just articulated is like, man, if all of knowledge is essentially going to be available for free, like the potential for a better world is right there, because that's the key ingredient is you need knowledge. And for the longest time, knowledge was sort of difficult for people to obtain, expensive, and it's now about to be different. People are going to have access to it. And it's sort of our job as, we're not really the architects. I think in one of your public speeches, you talked about how we're kind of like the people in the middle between these incredible different phases of history. As the people in the middle, it's our job to make sure that this knowledge is distributed fairly and used as a force for good instead of for something else.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I'm excited about.
It's, we haven't talked about this yet, but part of this is also to elevate, which is the name of my writing, is to elevate our definition of happiness and success. I think we live in a culture, which is part of the problem, that have defined success and happiness as this fleeting, instant, like, if you talk to a lot of people what happiness is, a lot of people would say things like, well, a great dinner or a rock concert or something very temporary. But I think, to me, happiness and joy and success are much, much longer term things. And you have to measure them over a longer period of time. And I mean, I don't know, I'm 61 years old. If you ask me today, and I think I've had this view for a long time, this whole living in reverse view, but the joy is the family that I've created with my wife. It's like we have 11 grandkids, and we have my relationship with my children, and now my grandchildren is like all my business success and failures, while they've been part of a very meaningful journey. And I'm very proud of much of what I've done and regret some of what I've done. But I have no regrets about this family, and the source of joy and happiness that they give me reminds me daily of, that's been, 40 years in the making. That didn't go, that's a lot of work and a lot of like consistency and persistence. And it just is like, I don't know, good wine or whatever the analog might be. It just gets better every day. And the sweetness of that joy is like, I can overcome almost anything because of them. I look at them and I say, I can have a business issue or a down quarter. I lost some money here, or something costed me more than I wanted, or something was annoying, and I could be irritated, sure, for a few minutes. And then I look on the side of my screen, I see this group of people. I'm thinking, that's a small issue. So it's just a reminder of the things that run deep in our souls that create real happiness are things that is the quality of your relationships. And we know that, I know that, but in our modern culture, we forget that. And it goes back to education. I think it's funny. Alain de Botton is somebody I've been inspired by a long time. He's a British, Swiss-born philosopher at Cambridge, written many books on love and on success and on lots of things. He started a school many years ago called the School of Life. And I think it's very inspiring because he basically says, he has a TED Talk about this, which is funny. He has many really good TED Talks, by the way. I highly recommend. He has this talk about, or it could be an article. I forget if it's TED Talk or an article. He has several TED Talks. They're all good. But he basically says that it's interesting that we've decided that education should be about like arithmetic and history and, certain topics. But like life is not part of education. We don't teach life because we just assume that people figure that out. Like he gives examples of like how I deal with a really grumpy teenage son, how I handle divorce, whatever the topics might be in life. And it is an interesting reflection that shouldn't we spend more time with our young people about what is happiness? How do you meditate? The importance of sleep, cooking. Like, shouldn't we teach people really how to cook healthy meals? Wouldn't that be a smart investment? So I think we've overdosed on, STEM is really important, but it is also important to know how to be happy and live a good life. Why is that not part of education? At least some pointers, some guardrails, some ideas. And, there's this alpha school in around you, and that's growing in America, which I think is an interesting, I don't know enough about it, but I've listened to a couple of podcasts with the CEO, and they, basically they believe three things I think I agree with wholeheartedly, that he finds it difficult for most people to agree on. One is that you can in 2 hours using modern technology, educate K-12 kids twice as fast in 2 hours than we do today. And he has proven it. And I completely, and we can go into that if you want, because I was chairman of Sylvan Learning Centers where I learned that education is like a ladder. And when people struggle, it's because they've missed a concept earlier, particularly in math, where most people end up struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And you can identify where those missed concepts are, and you can plug that in a couple of hours. And then you do remarkably much better. And it's so obvious. So you can do that. The second thing, well, actually, he starts. The first thing he believes, most important thing, is kids have to love school. You won't learn unless you love school, and too many kids don't love school. So that's their primary focus. The second focus is 2 hours a day on academics. And the third is have really high standards and expectations. They believe that we should have really high standards for our kids and our people, but it includes other topics than just math. It also includes kindness and civility, and not yell at people, and don't be angry, and don't publish hate. Hate has no place in a civilized society. I want to abolish hate.
That's a good goal. And by
Let's
the way,
do it.
I love The School of Life. I actually have several of his books, like the one about everything you need to know about life. You can, from Proust or something like that.
Yeah.
And he has another one on architecture and how architecture impacts your psychology. He's a really good writer. Highly recommend him. And I love that point too. Like, as a Greek, like, obviously I have to love, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And what's interesting about those individuals and that time period is that that's actually the question they were asking, which is that, what does it mean to live a good life? That's the question that this all started with. And education has ties to their thinking, but we have missed the main point, which is like, they didn't actually come to an answer. They were still asking the question about it. They were trying to figure it out. And we just assumed we knew the answer. Like the modern ethos, like I grew up fully infected with it. Like the answer was get good grades, get a really high SAT score, go to an Ivy League school, get a nice job in corporate America that pays you millions. Like that was literally like the definition of happiness supplied to me by culture. And man, nothing could be further from the truth. It's just, that's way too limited of a definition. And we'd be doing ourselves a favor if we kind of expand our education to include some other topics like you suggested.
Yeah, it worked for you. It worked for me. So I don't know. I'm maybe less critical of that. I'm more here's the problem I have, which is it is incomplete. I agree with you there. That's what you're saying. It's incomplete. It needs a sidecar of other objectives. I agree with that. However, people that are critical of that, they tend to not replace it with anything. And it's just free for all.
Yeah.
And I don't believe in that. I believe that's why I think this high expectations is important. But, I think the Ivy Leagues and our universities are in for a major struggle in how to be valuable. Because part of our current cultural crisis is a severe hangover that I don't know how many thousands of young people have woken up from this bad awakening where they put themselves in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt for an education that isn't worth anything. And they can hardly get a job, and they can't repay their debt, and they're angry. And it's partly understandable because they were told, work really hard, get into college, it solves everything. And then we somehow sent them on these, less maybe productive types of educations that, sounds good, but it's not really a market for. And we can't do that to kids. It's not right. So we have a lot of work to do to redefine. And in a world of AI, what does being human mean? What is work? We have a lot of challenges for sure. But again, I'm an optimist. I think the people I meet in the world, and I meet many, I think they have the athletic posture is what I write about a lot. I like athletic posture. I like leaning in, be part of solutions, don't be part of problems. Don't share and spread problems all day long. Do it sometimes, and sometimes it's certainly necessary to be a whistleblower and call on unacceptable things. I respect that a lot. But if you look at our media, it's like 98% of that, and maybe 2% of the rest, and that's out of whack. And we have to inject belief in people. Humans long to belong to something, and we need to believe in something. And you can't believe in destruction. You can't believe in hate. I mean, you can, and many people do, but I don't believe in it. I think it leads us to not the promised land.
Yeah. I agree. And human being, another thing a human being can't really believe in on its own is him or herself. It's not enough.
Exactly.
And that's
Well, let's
the,
talk about that. You want to talk about that a little bit, maybe?
yeah,
Purpose, the role of purpose, because that's been part of my belief system a long time. That's what brought me here. Uh, well, to you, I guess, but to all these beliefs is that when I was a young man, got in charge of turning around a McDonald's business in Sweden, I found, not because I was particularly smart or I was whatever, it was just necessity was the mother of invention. People hated McDonald's and they hated what we stood for. And they threw a lot of critique on us as a company. Much of it, by the way, was, I think, unfair and not warranted. But being defensive wasn't particularly effective as a strategy. So I started talking to them. And I learned that the areas they were concerned about had some merit. I didn't agree with them then, and I don't agree with them now, that it's all some kind of conspiracy theory that a bunch of capitalists went in a room and said, how do we destroy the world and how do we destroy the planet and how do we do? I don't believe in that. And that's not how it happened. But I do believe that businesses could do a lot more to help. So that's what I set out to do. And I did. Over 10 years, we built, the team and I built a much more progressive version of McDonald's, which had, you know, we ran our distribution trucks on recycled French fry oil and had, vegetarian options on the menu and worked with Weight Watchers. And we lean into the problems that people were concerned about. And it really worked beautifully. And what I learned from that experience is that my team, getting an 18-year-old to work hard in a restaurant and mop the floors and be excited is a lot easier when you're actually changing the world, when you're trying to do something really meaningful and bigger than yourself. And that's when I cemented this belief in myself that purpose bigger than product is really important part of building cultures. And I think the best, strongest cultures out there are mission oriented. And that's why since then I've only invested in mission oriented businesses, because I believe missions matter. And in a talent centric world where talent really matters, I think more and more people want to work for businesses that give a damn, that care about something. And so I'm very aligned with that. And that's true for a business, meaning a community of people. And it's true for you as an individual too. David Brooks writes in his second mountain, I think, this powerful line about the goal in life is to lose yourself in something bigger than yourself. And I think that's really important. If you only care about yourself, you become pretty depressed quickly. I'm not that interesting. You have to care about something bigger than yourself. And, for a long time, we should talk about religion too, because for a long time, religion played that role. Today, it plays less of a role in many people's lives. And we have to figure out, what has it replaced? Can you replace, Jesus with TikTok? I don't think that's particularly good. Can you replace it with something else? Yes, I'm open to it. Everybody can find their thing, but it has to be something bigger and meaningful than you. And it has to be in service of more people than you.
yeah, I
I'm a
think,
big believer. If I was king for, I've been asked this, if you were king for a day, what would you do? Well, if I was president of this country, one of the first orders I would do is a mission year for every graduated high schooler, like the Mormons do, like I did. I was in the military. I think it was mandatory when I grew up in Sweden. I was in the Marines. I think spending a year or two of your life in really difficult jobs that are not fun, that are not paid, you sleep in bunk beds with 12, 15 other people that you will never mate ever in your life, because you're just bunched together stochastically by chance, and do that in service of something greater than yourself, I think builds real fabric of culture in a society that America needs more than ever. It will bridge gaps. It will help a lot. And I cannot understand why we're not doing that. And you look at Israel, I don't know if it's a hairy topic these days. I get it, but read Startup Nation, and you ask yourself, why this little country, who, by the way, have been spending most of their GDP on defense for a long time, how can they be this successful as an economy and as a democratic society? And a lot of it goes down to when you have to spend 2-3 years serving your country, when you come out of that, you have matured greatly and you're ready to serve in ways that you're prepared for, in ways that most educations and other things can't prepare you for. It builds cohesion of a country. That's one example. But I think there are many others. And I think that would be a smart move.
I love that idea. I've actually written about it in Profit Plus. I feel like a service program, doesn't have to be military, but if people
No.
serve your community in some capacity for 1 or 2 years, and it's the best education you could possibly get. And it absolutely will. Like the Israelis have built a phenomenally cohesive society, and they've been super successful in a very short period of time, right? We're only talking about what, 80 years or something like that to go from where it started to where it is today. Those types of transformations are possible through an adoption of this kind of collective mindset. And it's not that you don't pursue, like, the interesting thing about this topic, it's not that you don't pursue individual goals and dreams. You absolutely do. But you do it in a way where you keep in mind your relationship with your community. So you're not going to like do something that is obviously bad for your community. You're going to pursue your dreams as long as it makes sense and it's good for everybody. And that mindset is sort of hard to train without a real life experience. I think that's where the mission idea is so powerful, is you actually need to see that in operation to kind of understand it. And the way we're doing it now is by luck. Like, you had this experience where you had a tough situation where you had a bunch of people who hated your business, which caused you. And in my case, like, I had a bunch of like lawsuits and stuff that kind of woke me up to this idea. But not everybody has that experience. And so to find a way to make it institutional is a great idea.
Yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah, we didn't have a chance. I have an idea though. There's so much more I want to ask you about, because you've actually taken this set of ideas that you've been developing for 30 years and you're actually living it out, in business. And you did it in these massive corporations like McDonald's and Chipotle, but also as an investor and a business owner. And I want to get into that in another episode though, because I feel like actually there's a lot of really interesting topics we can talk about, where we get into education, we get into healthcare, and we get into maybe housing. The three things that are like really messed up in this country, and discuss kind of how you could take this blueprint and apply it in a very practical way and say, okay, let's say we adopted all these ideas and we took on those challenges. What would it look like? I feel like that would be a fun episode. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert in housing, but I agree with you that it's woefully underserved. And I also have, I mean, just to say a few, sing a few bars on that is, we have created a bureaucratic red tape regulatory state that is terrible. And it might be impossible to change. So we have to be very humble about the challenges we face, because it almost doesn't seem to matter who you send to Washington to fix some of these problems. It seems almost impossible. And talking to anybody that's tried, we can talk about Jennifer Polka's book, who spent 10 years trying to fix some of it. It's a topic for another day, Nick, but and I don't want to spend a lot of time on politics or political infrastructure, but I think it's worth stating to people that think about this is that there are three ways you can change our society politically. One is who you send to Washington, or, your governorship or whatever, like the election, like the who. The second thing is the what. What's the policy? What are we going to do when we win? And the third thing is like operationally. Okay, how do we get this done? I would argue, and I think you would agree, and most people would agree, we spend like 90% of our energy on the who. We spend woefully inappropriate time on the what. Like, let's have policy conversations. What's the smartest policies here? You and I have touched about some of ideas for capitalism, but there's lots to talk about, like education policy. Like, what should it be? Policy matters. Strategy matters. But the topic we never spend time on, almost none, is like operationalizing it, the legality, the bureaucracy. It's really hard to change these things. And we can talk, I recommend you put Philip Howard on your show. I'm happy to introduce you to Philip. He runs a not-for-profit called Common Sense, has spent his life on the red tape stuff.
Yep.
He's
Love to.
he's very compelling. And it's both depressing and inspiring to talk to him because he's right. We built this legal concrete that makes it unnavigable, unnavigable.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just a hint to our next conversation if you want to have one.
No, I would love to, man. This has been a super fun and inspiring conversation. I think people are going to have a lot to think about. I'm going to encourage everyone to follow your writing and thinking on Elevate. And we've really only covered half the story here. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. Like, guys, Mats is an incredible business leader and entrepreneur, and he's done so much already and has a whole bunch of big plans for the future. And we're going to get into that in our next episode together. So Mats, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much, Nick. You're great. Thank you.
Thank you.